Today, we're going to talk about the new RPA, the December 21st release. It's supposed to come out in the second week of December. Last I heard, they're still on track. This is part 2. So the new RPA, it's the first major revision, as I said before, since 2014, and there is a lot of it has been revised, but yet a lot of it is the same. So there's quite a bit of information in the RPA that you're used to, but there's also a lot of new features with the RPA. And you got your first look at it perhaps a couple of weeks ago when we did session 1. The biggest change is probably what's called the grid. The grid is the first 3 pages, and that is a huge revision, if you will, a reorganization of the contract. It went from 10 pages to 16 pages. They did add a lot more material to it, but they added the grid as well. When I say they, I mean CAR. Okay, so a few important points about the new RPA. As I said last time, keep in mind the grid is not intended to be a summary. It is actually contractual, and it contains specific terms relative to the contract. So don't look at it as a summary. Look at it as a very convenient location of most of the negotiable features of an RPA. So it contains time frames for performance, amounts of money to be paid, and who's responsible for the payment. Of course, the balance of the RPA is just as important, and it contains the explanations about the various features listed in the grid and outlines the obligations of both the buyer and the seller. So as you review the RPA, you should go through not only the grid, of course, that's pretty easy to get a handle on. It's pretty well structured. You should also go through pages 14 through 16 and become familiar, because there's quite a few new features in those various clauses. And of course, call if you have any questions, and I'm always happy to help out, of course. All right. So part 1, we reviewed the RPA page by page, and we looked at just paragraphs 1 through 3L. So we didn't get too far into the RPA. We're going to get a lot further into it today. But the top of page 1, if you remember, it has the information about the offer, about agency. We discussed the importance of being careful when you fill that out. And then it starts the grid. The bottom of page 1 begins the grid. So paragraph 3 is the grid, and then subparagraphs 3A, 3B, 3C. And we went through the grid all the way to 3L. So we got all the way through the contingencies. So now part 2, we're going to continue a page by page, paragraph by paragraph review, starting with 3M today, and hopefully get all the way through paragraph 8. Not making a promise, but I'm going to try. I am going to keep it down to an hour. I'm going to try to stop at an hour, and then we'll have run a little bit over probably for questions if we have any questions. Lindsay's going to help me out with that. Okay, so picking up where we left off, paragraph 3M in the grid. So 3M talks about possession. And so possession, there's been a change from the old RPA. The boilerplate in the old RPA said 6 p.m. on the day recorded. That was a change from the one from 14. They went back to the old time frame. And so now the default is possession upon notice of recording. So when you're notified by title company that it is recorded, then possession starts at that time. Or you can go back to what you might be used to, and that is 6 p.m., or you can make it any time. I would argue you shouldn't make it before closing unless there's an agreement to occupy early. And of course, it's applicable in M2, which of course is the very next paragraph. If M2 is incorporated into the contract, and it would be incorporated by checking one of these boxes, then possession would be pursuant to whichever document you included. So those are after close of escrow possession documents. So from 29 days or fewer, use the CAR form SIP. There's been a few revisions to that, but not too major. The SIP gives you a license to remain, the seller, gives the seller a license to remain in the property. The purpose of the SIP, and I want to just caution agents, it's not the biggest infraction, but you should avoid referring to rental terms when you're talking about the SIP. Why? Because the SIP was created to avoid the obligation of the buyer, who is now the owner, to function as a landlord. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. State of California, tenants have quite a few rights and landlords not so much. So in a rent back situation, if there's a actual rent back, then the buyer becomes a landlord and the seller becomes a tenant. And courts have held buyers to landlord-tenant law, which I would argue most buyers don't have a clue about. And so it can be kind of problematic for a buyer who's not really interested in being a landlord, but is allowing the seller to stay in the property for a short period of time. So SIP was created not as a rent back. It is a license to remain in the property. So the fee paid is not a rental. It's a license fee. If you're holding money to guarantee that the seller maintains the property and gets out on time, that is not a deposit. That's a possession fee. So those terms are used in the SIP deliberately to avoid references to landlord-tenant law. I will tell you that it has not been tested in court yet. I'm not real sure. The courts won't, say, we don't care what you call it. It's a landlord-tenant situation, and they're going to apply the law. CAR Legal believes that if you're under 30 days, we have a pretty good chance of prevailing that it is not a rental agreement. It's simply part of the purchase agreement facilitating a seller who wants to remain in their property a little while. So that's the SIP. If it's 30 days or longer, then you attach the RLAS, which is the rent back after sale. And that is clearly a rental. And again, CAR believes if it's 30 days or longer, the courts will absolutely assume that it's a rental agreement. I'm not encouraging you to do this, but there is no rule against using an SIP for a slightly longer period than 30 days, but you're probably going to lose the advantage, as I just discussed, because the courts are going to be pretty strict about it's a 30-day or longer possession by the seller. The seller is a tenant. Okay, so that's how you can modify possession by including either the SIP or the RLAS. And then, of course, if it's a tenant-occupied unit, then you would check the tenant-occupied box and attach the TOPA. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. And any property that has a tenant in it at the time the offer is written should include a TOP, and this box here should be checked, this box in M3. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes as I get into these various addenda. Okay, documents. The seller delivers documents within 7 days. So all of the seller disclosures, all of the different documents a seller is supposed to provide, the default for all of them is 7 days. We sign and return escrow instructions 5 days. That's important so that escrow can get started. Sometimes escrows are reluctant to get too far into an escrow without getting their instructions returned. And so they've made that right up front. And that's important that you inform your clients that they need to execute those escrow documents and get them back to escrow. That's very important for escrows to move quickly forward. And if there's any misunderstanding, outstandings, let's find out about it early in the transaction. Time to pay the HOA fee. This is new. 3 days. So pay and order HOA fees 3 days. Be sure your seller understands that. Escrows have learned not to take money from the buyer's deposit to pay for HOA docs. That's very problematic. So they're going to want a credit card or money put into escrow to pay for those HOA documents. And again, 3 days. And we all know why. It takes HOA quite a bit of time to get those documents out. And we want them to the buyer as quickly as possible. And then finally, this is another new thing. Smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors and water heater bracing must be done within 7 days of acceptance. Why? Because frequently the appraiser will call that out if it's not done. And then that delays the transaction. It causes extra expense to the buyer, perhaps for having to pay for an appraiser to come back and certify that's done. CAR legal has had, CAR, the legal hotlines had lots of problems with that. I've had a few issues with it over the years as well. And so getting it done early was the purpose of getting that forward. O has been left blank because O looks like 0. So there is no 3-0 because that, is that a 30 or 3? So nothing there. Okay, P is items included and excluded, and this has been significantly expanded. So items included is P1. Now, this is important to note. We're not going to get into a lot of detail about paragraph 9B, but keep this in mind. P3P, paragraph 3P1, lists a lot of items that are included if they're checked. That's not the entire list of everything that's included. Paragraph 9B also has items listed in it that are included. And those items, most of you are fairly familiar with them. It's the fixtures, window coverings. The definition of window coverings has been greatly expanded. There's been more clarification on security systems and what you call smart homes and those kinds of things. That's all contained in 9B. We won't get to 9B today, but our next session will go through that in detail. But just keep in mind that both clients understand that this is not a complete list of what's included. It's just some of the items that frequently are at issue. Is it included or is it not included? So you check the boxes that you want included. There's boxes to type in additional items. And as I said before, if you type beyond the blank, the text overflow addendum will automatically attach. I checked on a question I had last time. If you have the text overflow addendum for more than one paragraph, in other words, in paragraph 3P, you're typing something in one of these blanks and it goes long. And then in another part of the contract, you need to type something and it goes long. Does it generate 2 overflow text addendums or 1? It generates 1. So the one addendum just lists the various paragraphs that it applies to. Okay. Now, the one thing that's kind of interesting is bathroom mirrors is by default checked. And if that's checked, and you don't want the bathroom mirrors to be included, then you want to uncheck that, or at the very least, exclude it, listing it in P2 below. And I guess CAR has had lots of problems with bathroom mirrors. Not to be personal, I have nice mirrors in my bathroom. They're hung on wires like a picture. They look like giant pictures. And so I can understand, if I were to sell the house, I'd kind of like to keep those mirrors, but you're not allowed to if you follow the default in the contract. The mirrors will be included unless excluded. So if you exclude them, then that will remove the validity of this check mark. Okay. Excluded items, that's where you list those. All right. Allocation of costs, paragraph Q. So it lists the items and it lists who pays, and it's buyer, seller, or both. There are a few specifics, and we'll go through them. And of course, column 2 references the paragraph that gives you more detail about these items. You're going to see how that works in a minute, because I'm going to jump back and forth as I get into pages 4 and beyond and start getting into the various clauses in the contract. I'm going to jump back to this grid. And you can do the same thing when you're actually working on the RPA by hovering over one of these paragraph numbers. It will take you to that paragraph. So keep in mind that this is the paragraph to explain this. And then, these are different columns and depending on what we're talking about. So let's take a look at the allocation of costs. Natural hazard zone disclosure report, either the buyer pays, the seller pays, or both pays. And if both pay, it's divided 50-50 unless you specify otherwise. And then you could have other terms, whether an environmental report is included and provided by. Here's where you're going to run long, I think. Not a very big blank. If you specify the company, it would go by the provided by. Okay, additional reports. This is where you might have a termite or a wood-destroying pest report. Keep in mind that in this grid, paragraph Q, it's the report only. If you want also a clearance, and there's, pluses and minuses. If you're the seller and the offer includes a clearance, you should not agree to that unless you have you've already had a termite inspection done so that you know what it'll cost to provide the clearance. Some houses would be quite minimal, maybe no dollars, maybe a couple of $1,000s. I think tenting has gotten a little more expensive, maybe $3,000-4,000. We've had transactions where to get a clearance, it's been more than 30 or 38,000 is one I can remember. And the seller didn't have a clue it'd be that expensive, and they agreed to provide a clearance. So CAR recommends you don't include a clearance in the contract, in the RPA when you write it. Wait and you do the request for repairs. Having experience with selling real estate, I'm very sympathetic to a buyer who wants to be sure they bought a house and they need to have a clearance to get their loan, and they want the seller to commit up front to providing the clearance. So I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing for a buyer to ask, but hopefully the seller side of the transaction has already done their homework and knows what that clearance would cost. I highly recommend listing agents look into that right away so they can deal with offers that come in and ask for clearance. Okay, so who pays for the report? This is for the report, not the clearance. Either the buyer will pay, the seller will pay, or both pay. And again, both is 50-50. Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater strapping, same thing. Government required inspection reports, either the buyer or the seller. In San Diego County, there is at this time, no jurisdiction that I'm aware of. If anybody wants to correct me, let me know, and I'll get that word out. But no jurisdiction requires a report. So is a point of sale. So not true with LA. With LA, the seller has to provide a report, get an inspection, and provide a report to the buyer. So if you happen to be selling a house in LA, number one, I would hope you have some expertise in that neighborhood. But number two, be aware that you're going to have to provide the buyer with a government inspection report in LA. The same with what actions are required as a point of sale. Now, in San Diego, the city of San Diego, there is a point of sale requirement that the plumbing fixtures be certified as low flow, that can be assigned to the buyer. Most of you understand that if you've sold a property in the city of San Diego, you've been through this, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. If you're confused by that or not familiar with it, give me a call and I'll walk you through that. Okay. No other jurisdiction requires a point of sale confirmation that the fixtures are in fact low flow, that the fixtures that are installed are low flow. As a point of sale throughout the state, the seller has to state whether they are or not, but they don't have to change them in order to sell the house if they're not. Okay, escrow fees. Again, buyer, seller, both. I would caution not to check both because, again, the contract says both means the fees are split 50-50. And, one side may have more fees than the other side. So I'm recommending that you check the box, each pay their own. That's what many of you have been taught to put on the offer. So now you have that ability just to check the box. And of course, you name the escrow holder if you choose to. And then title insurance, same thing with that.
Walt?
Yes.
Oh, we have a question about Q5. It says, so if San Diego has no governmental report requirement, do we leave this blank?
You can leave it blank. Yeah, don't check. Exactly. You can leave it blank because there is no report required. Good question. Okay. Title insurance, buyers.
Excuse me, but what about AB 13? The FHDS?
I don't want to get too far in the weeds with that. I'm going to do a class on that, but let me answer the question quickly for the group. And then if anybody is involved in a transaction where this is problematic, call me. I have confirmed as recently as about 2 days ago, there is no requirement for a point of sale, defensible space inspection in San Diego County. See, and that's the key. The FHDS talks about it, and paragraph 4B, the boilerplate says there is no point of sale requirement to have the property inspected. CAR has had a lot of trouble with CAL FIRE because CAL FIRE consistently has put out the word, oh, yeah, you got to have your house inspected. Not true. The state law says you do not have to unless the local jurisdiction says you do. Truckee absolutely can't sell a house in Truckee without getting a defensible space inspection before you sell the house. City of San Diego, unfortunately, has pamphlets out that imply that the seller must have his house inspected. I've raised that issue with the fire marshal in charge of that. I've talked to her a couple times on the phone. She's sort of reluctantly agreeing with me. I've asked her to give me municipal code that contradicts that. I've not been provided that. So, again, it's a point of sale. Right now, the law says you have to maintain defensible space. An example I use all the time is my house. I'm in a very high fire zone. I had, if you know me, you know I have a ton of firewood. I have an outdoor fire pit, and I just love having a fire in the evening. And so I'm constantly collecting eucalyptus. I have a couple of cords of wood at any given time. That used to be stacked up pretty close to my house. The law says I can't do that. The law says it's got to be 30 feet away from my house. I've never moved it because of the law. I moved it because my insurance company told me I had to. As a point of sale, had I not moved the wood, I'd be in violation of the law. I can sell my house even though I'm in violation of the law, and I do not have to get a defensible space inspection. I hope that kind of clarifies it a little bit. And I'm going to do a class on the FHDS because I do get quite a few questions, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. Basically, unfortunately, sellers are ordering and listing agents are ordering inspections. And once you order it, CAL FIRE will not let you cancel it. And then you kind of get into the weeds a little bit because you got to wait for that inspection and then, deal with anything that the inspection reveals that might have to be corrected and who's going to pay for that. And, I'll make one other comment. Not a bad thing to get the inspection if you're the buyer side, because heaven forbid, 6 months from now, a year from now, they start doing inspections and then giving properties citations to make corrections. And now the buyer's stuck paying for these corrections. So a buyer could maybe want a report and compel the seller to order one, but the code won't force the seller to do that. Okay, buyers, lenders, title policy, that's paid by the buyer. Traditionally, transfer taxes either side, city transfer taxes. We don't have any in our area, but you select that. HOA fee. This is civil code. The documents that are required to be provided to a buyer by civil code and in the contract in paragraph 11, the civil code also says that a buyer cannot pay for that, can't even waive it and agree to pay for it. And the reason for that is HOA tends to charge a little extra, too much money, and the legislature felt like if the sellers who have some, input with the HOA knew they were having to pay these exorbitant fees, maybe they could pressure their own HOA to put those fees in line. So they made it a requirement, the seller to pay this so that, they could put some downward pressure on those fees. And it has helped. Prior to that law being passed, I've seen HOA fees as high as document fees as high as $2,000. And that's ludicrous. I mean, push a button and they get emailed to the escrow or to the buyer. $2,000 kind of ridiculous. So anyway, that's required. You can't change that. Certification fee, that's not necessarily required, but sellers, a certification fee is a lender requirement in some cases. So it's the buyer's lender who's requiring it. The boilerplate says the buyer should pay for it. Transfer fees, negotiable. Private transfer fees, normally the seller, most of them are set up for the seller to pay, but the buyer can pay them, and or both. And then finally, other fees, you can list them if there's any that you're aware of. And then the home warranty. Now, the thing with the home warranty, you'll notice here, and when we come back together next time, we'll talk about paragraph 10, but there's no coverage specified here. Why? Because in paragraph 10, it says that the coverage is whatever the buyer wants to cover. And paragraph 10 explains that if the cost of what the buyer wants exceeds what's agreed to in 3Q18, which is right here, then the buyer is going to pick up the difference. So basically, a seller will agree to pay a certain dollar amount and should not really be concerned about whether air conditioning's covered, the pool's covered. I mean, that's a buyer question. And so buyers and buyers agents might check with HOA companies to figure out, the kinds of coverage they would like, how much that will cost, and then set that number as the not to exceed number and maybe name the HOA, the home warranty company. Okay, and then any other terms. This could be where you type in seller shall provide section 1 clearance. Say that's where that would go if you were going to make that part of your offer. Any other terms that weren't specified in the grid. So that takes us through the grid. So now we're getting into a whole lot less, in fact, almost no blanks to fill in. There are still a few you'll see here, but there's still some boxes to check. And we're getting into paragraphs that, give us details about the things covered in the grid. Now, the first paragraph 4 talks about property addenda and advisories. And so 4A is property addenda. With the new RPA, there are now new forms that are that are property addenda for specific types of transactions. So the RPA is designed for the sale of a property built and zoned for single family residential use. And that includes a property that's rented. So it's a single family property. The RPA is designed for that. The RPA can also, and is now, the form to use for probate transactions. And of course, you would attach the PAPA, the Probate Agreement Purchase Addendum. It can be used for manufactured home sales, the new RPA, not a unique RPA, the new one, for manufactured home sales, and you attach the manufactured home purchase addendum. For tenant occupied single family residence, anytime you sell a home, can't say this enough, anytime you sell a home that has a tenant in it, even if the tenant's going to be out tomorrow, but I'm writing the offer today and my buyer's signing it today, include the TOP, Tenant Occupied Property Addendum. I'm going to give you a little more detail about that in a minute. I can tell you we've had a few nightmares with property that had a tenant in it, and everybody agreed, including the tenant, that they would get out. But guess what? The tenant changed their mind. And in the state of California, it ain't so easy to get a tenant out of a property. So always, when you sell a property that has a tenant in it, when your buyer is executing the contract, include the TOPA, and you'll see how that works in a moment. Okay. There are two new forms, not too common yet, especially in our area. CAR believes, and I think they're probably right, that the TICPA, a tenancy in common purchase, will become a little more common. Prices are getting so high that people are going to be buying houses that aren't necessarily mom and dad and the kids, but two unique entities, two people, maybe they're friends, maybe they're business associates, maybe there's somebody just I don't want to use the word hooked up. I think it has a special definition, but two people who got together and now they're tenants in common in a purchase. So there is a purchase addendum for that. I don't think you'll see it too much. Or a stock cooperative purchase. There are stock cooperatives in the Bay Area. I don't think there are any in the Southern California area, certainly not in San Diego that I'm aware of. Okay. Now, with the new RPA, they've deleted some purchase contracts. They deleted the manufactured purchase agreement, the MHPA. That'll be gone in a couple of weeks. And they are going to delete the probate purchase agreement because you can use the new RPA with those addenda I just referenced. And then finally, I just want to remind you, and I expanded this list to include all other purchase agreements in the CAR library. And so there are still unique purchase agreements. So if you're purchasing a residential property of 2 to 4 units, then I recommend you use the RIPA, the Residential Income Property Purchase Agreement. That is designed for multi-units, including duplexes. So that's the form of choice for that. If you're selling a commercial property, then you would use the Commercial Purchase Agreement CPA. I'll just make this comment for the RE/MAX Connections people, which includes, of course, RE/MAX United. RE/MAX United is, we're all RE/MAX Connections. You're just keeping the name United for marketing purposes, but we're all one big happy family, and we all fly the banner RE/MAX Connections. Okay, so for RE/MAX Connections people, if you are doing a commercial transaction that is in any way associated with a business opportunity, please give me a call. That there's some special situations we need to discuss about that. And, I want to give you a little guidance and talk to you a little bit about that. So a commercial purchase agreement is not necessarily a business op. It is a commercial property. Okay. Purchase of vacant land, use the VLPA, Vacant Land Purchase Agreement. If you are selling a property that is owner occupied and a notice of default has been filed, you must use the NODPA. Otherwise, wasn't our agent, it was the spouse of one of our agents, bought a property that was owner occupied and had a notice of default filed. And that person did that purchase separate from the spouse. So the spouse wasn't involved in it. guess what? The spouse got sued anyway. And why? Because they didn't conform the purchase agreement that these two private people, kind of a for sale by owner type of a situation where a person bought it not using an agent, even though this person was married to an agent. They didn't follow civil code. The NODPA is designed to comply with civil code when you purchase a property that is owner occupied and an NOD has been filed. So that can be very problematic if you don't, if you have that situation and you don't use the NODPA. Not going to be too common right now, but market cycles up and down. There'll be a time where this will be a little more common. Okay. For the purchase of new construction in a subdivision that the house has not been built, the house has not yet been built. It's in a subdivision, but it will be completed during escrow. Use the new construction purchase agreement. For the purchase of new construction in a subdivision that is already built, the house is already built, then use the AB Sbsa, the already built subdivision purchase agreement. That isn't going to come up too often because the builders do their own purchase agreements. So you're not going to come upon that very often. If you're purchasing a condominium conversion, you should use the CCSPA, Condominium Conversion Purchase Agreement. So that's the 7 purchase agreements that still exist in addition to the new RPA. Okay, so now back to our RPA. So if you have one of these situations, you will check the appropriate box. So if you have a probate purchase, then you check the probate agreement, purchase addendum, and that form will automatically attach. And I included that in your handout. I'm going to walk you through it real quickly, give you a couple of highlights. So the property is part of a probate, a decedent's estate. That's the default. Or it can also be a conservatorship, a guardianship, or a receivership. The laws that govern probate, the laws that govern conservatorship, guardianship, and receivership are the same as the laws that govern probate. So this form would work for those as well. And of course, the probate advisory will attach, and that's important for the buyer to review. So I highlighted that so you're aware of it. You determine what type of probate it is, and there's a paragraph that discusses that. And the seller may inform you as to the type of probate it is, or they may do it later in the transaction. If court confirmation is not known, then that would be the default. And then the seller will inform the buyer whether court confirmation is required or not. Don't want to get in the weeds of probate, but a lot of times, and I've seen it, bite us a couple of times. So no court confirmation is required. Well, that may not be absolutely true. If any beneficiary objects, beneficiary is entitled, even if the court is not going to confirm a transaction, the administrator must inform the beneficiaries of the transaction. If a beneficiary objects, it's going to end up in court. It's going to go to the court. And so it could be that a court confirmation that wasn't required ends up being required. So that's why it sort of reads this way. It's undetermined, and they believe that it's not required, and they'll inform you throughout the transaction whether it's required or not. Now, if court confirmation is required, then that box is checked, and then it talks a little bit about overbid. It also gives some more details about when court confirmation is required. The thing you want to pay attention to if you have the buyer is if you default on this purchase contract, you could be liable not only for the full deposit, but other costs incurred by the seller as administered by the court, and the court will go after them. So this is an important cautionary note to the buyer. And then there may be a requirement that the buyer remove contingencies prior to them going to court confirmation. And so that these are contingencies that do not have to be removed. So if they're checked, then they get to stay. Otherwise, it's all contingency. That's the boilerplate. And then finally, an important point is in a probate sale, even though the RPA might have liquidated damages, mediation, arbitration included in it, liquidated damages and arbitration by initialing, mediation is in the boilerplate, it will not be part of a probate transaction. Why? Because the court has jurisdiction and they're not going to be governed by the liquidated damages clause or the arbitration clause. All right. Now, manufactured home purchase, you would attach the manufactured or mobile home purchase addendum. And that is for any manufactured or mobile home. It's going to be called a manufactured home in the contract. So any manufactured or mobile home that's being purchased would use this form. And then there's two types of manufactured homes. One is a personal property manufactured home, and that might be on leased land, or it might be sold with real property, but it's a personal property because they've never had it inspected after having attached it to a foundation, and they don't have the right certifications to classify it as real property. So it'll be a personal property manufactured home, even if it's sold on real property. And of course, if it is a manufactured home being sold with real property and it's a personal property manufactured home, you want to allocate the difference between or the division between what the home costs and what the property costs, because you're taxed on the property as part of your property taxes. You are not taxed on the manufactured home as a part of your property taxes. Okay. If it's a real property manufactured home, then include the parcel number, and that home will have been attached and been certified by the health and not the health and safety, but the home. Can't think of their name. The HCD. There we go. The Department of Housing and Community Development. Okay. There's an additional description where you describe the unit. And then there's some financing terms. There's some documentation that the seller must provide. I want to bring your attention to this, the transfer disclosure statement. Highly recommended that you do not use the TDS, but use the MHTDS, the manufactured home and mobile home transfer disclosure statement, because that has some questions on it that are unique to a manufactured home. So use that in the transaction. And if you use these forms, if you need to use these forms, you have any questions, give me a call. Another thing to keep in mind is, in addition to satisfying maybe lender requirements and the buyer, conforming to what the seller wants as far as what the contract says, the buyer also must apply to a park if it's in a park, and there may be park conditions that must be met, often repairs, before the park will allow the transaction to close. Okay, tenant occupied property addendum. That's a form that's brand new, and again should be used anytime you are writing an offer on a property that has a tenant in it at this time. Now, the first thing I want to point out is a lot of times people think that tenants are only people that sign rental agreements or are month to month or are making payments. That's not true. Any adult living in a property who is not the seller is by definition a tenant. So often the term tenant by consent. So, a lady owns a nice house and her boyfriend moves in with her. He's a tenant by law. He's a tenant by consent, one would hope, but he's a tenant. We've actually had the reverse situation. We had a gentleman own a house and his girlfriend moved in, and everybody thought the girlfriend was going to move out. She wouldn't move out. When it closed escrow, she went and got a lawyer and asserted her tenant's rights. And our poor buyer took him almost 2 months to get that ex-girlfriend out of the property. And at the beginning, unfortunately, the agent and the seller had a incorrect belief that she wasn't a tenant because she was his girlfriend. Not true. All right, so keep that in mind. All right. So if the tenant, if the boilerplate is the tenant's going to remain in possession, that's the boilerplate. Now, if the property is going to be delivered vacant, then you check that. Then that's fine. The seller can say, oh, no, they're moving out. Here's the beauty of this form. The beauty of this form is that if the seller cannot get the tenant out, the seller is only liable to the buyer for the buyer's out-of-pocket expenses for this purchase. And the buyer can elect to not close and then, ask for his expenses and would be entitled to them, or close with the tenant in. So that's an improvement over the way the situation is now, or an improvement where you have a tenant in the property, but you don't use the tenant occupied purchase addendum, and the tenant doesn't move out. Now the seller has maybe significant damages to the buyer because he can't get the tenant out. So this is the paragraph that explains that it limits the seller's damages to a buyer in the event the seller, acting in good faith, is trying to get the tenant out. The tenant agreed to get out, but the tenant changed their mind. Okay, the tenant remaining in possession, there's some specific terms. I won't go through them. You can review the form. There's documentation required if a tenant is in the property, and that's listed. There are representations the seller must make regarding the tenant and the relationship between the seller and the tenant. Tenancy in common, that form included in the packet. I'm not going to go over it. It's pretty unusual right now, and that is where there are multiple owners to a property, and they share ownership, but not necessarily occupancy. And then a stock cooperative purchase addendum, and that's where property is owned by a stock cooperative. That is treated like a condominium, whereas the tenants in common is not treated like a condominium. Okay. Other addenda, paragraph 4B, and then there's a whole list of addenda that you can check. If you're doing a short sale, check the short sale. If you have an addendum as attached, you're selling your own property, then you know about the addendum that we want you to attach to the purchase agreement that outlines the buyer's obligations to you when you're selling your own personal property, and that's to help us with claims should they be filed against, with our E&O. If there's a backup addendum, the SWIPI, the SWPI, any addendums you attach, when you check this box, it will automatically be attached to the purchase agreement. Likewise with advisories. Now, the 4 that are checked, and now you're familiar with them. Every time you do an RPA, these 4 print out. They did not check the Sbsa. Why? Because that means every time you send the RPA to anybody, they're going to get all these 4 forms plus the Sbsa, and there's quite a few pages of the Sbsa. So I'm not saying don't check it, but I will tell you a lot of times I ask for the offer and I end up getting, 50 pages because, all kinds of things have been attached to the offer, and they become part of the offer because they don't become contractually part of the offer. They become part of the paperwork that gets included every time, the offer is, sent somewhere as a PDF or something like that. Okay, but there's a list of them. You check the ones that apply. Additional terms affecting the purchase price. Okay, buyer represents the funds will be good when deposited in escrow. That's nothing new there. The buyer will deliver the deposit directly to escrow. And as outlined in paragraph 3D1. So 3D1, it's by wire transfer and you could write in something here, personal check. The buyer wants to take a personal check. Now, often escrow doesn't want to receive a personal check, so that could be problematic. So if the escrow does not want to accept the means by which the buyer wants to deposit, then the contract says the buyer must satisfy the escrow. Now, an escrow company will probably take a check, but they might not. But they're not going to take Bitcoin. I can pretty much be certain of that. So, so the buyer thinks he's going to send all his Bitcoin over there, and escrow saying, no, not so fast. The good news is the contract covers that. They have to go with a wire if the escrow requires it. That's in the boilerplate. Okay, increased deposit. So, and this isn't increasing the deposit as part of that offer. It is increasing the deposit during the escrow. So an increased deposit delivered to escrow the same way as the initial deposit. And the parties agree to execute a DID if they're going to add the increased deposit to the liquidated damages. And so the form DID is executed at the time the increased deposit is delivered to escrow. They changed the DID name. It's pretty much the same. Used to be called an RID because the civil code talks about a receipt for deposits, but that caused confusion. It's not a receipt saying, okay, yeah, I got your money. It's a statement that, here's the obligation to provide it, and that it is part of the increased deposit. It's a statement that says that this deposit is part of liquidated damages. Civil code says that if an increased the deposit is to be part of the liquidated damages, the liquidated damages clause must be restated at the time the increased deposit is received. So that's what the DID does for us. Okay. Retention of deposit. If paragraph 29 is initialed by the party, now paragraph 29, we won't get to that today for sure, but that is the liquidated damages clause. So both parties have initialed liquidated damages if it's part of the contract. And often it's the seller. The seller wants to have some sort of forfeiture of deposit built into the contract. The boilerplate says, buyer and seller, you need to check with an attorney. Why? Because civil code has a lot to say about forfeited deposits. I always tell agents, 2 words to never, ever, never, never, ever, ever, never write is the word forfeit or the word penalty, because courts do not recognize contracts that call for forfeiture. They do not recognize contracts that call for penalties, and especially contracts that, for as far as forfeiture is concerned, contracts that have liquidated damages clauses in them, because that is your remedy as a seller to follow the liquidated damages clause, not to insist on forfeiture. So writing a non-refundable deposit forfeited, even the word non-refundable without forfeited, is very problematic. And so, when these comes up, case by case, agents call me. There are workarounds to that. You can sell an option rather than require the deposit to be released. And then the option gets released. The money that's being held as deposit gets released as an option payment. And if that interests you because you have a need for that, because your seller wants to have the buyer release the deposit, then call me and I'll go into the detail on that. But this is just important. This clause is not new, by the way. This clause used to be right next to the liquidated damages clause at the end of the contract. But CAR has had so many problems, and as I have too, people not understanding that, you're not really supposed to have forfeited deposits, that they wanted to put it up right up, with the deposit so people could see it right up front. Okay, all cash offer. If the offer is all cash, then it's going to be specified in 3A in the grid, and no loan is needed to purchase, and the agreement is not contingent upon a loan, and the buyer shall, within the time specified in 3H1, see it right there, deliver verification of sufficient funds. Now 3H1, the default is with the offer, or you can check a box and it can be later, but we talked about that last time. These are all designed to be included with the offer so a seller can make a better determination on how strong the offer is. All right. Verification, okay. Loans. The first loan, is itemized in paragraph C1 there, and it's if there's an FHA or VA loan or seller financing, then those boxes are checked. Otherwise, it's conventional financing. Okay. And if it's a second loan, there's no FHA or VA on the second loan, but there could be seller financing or other on the second loan. So the terms of the loan are, again, contained in 3E, part of the grid. If the contract information for the buyer's lender is different than what was provided in paragraph 6, paragraph 6B is the pre-qual or pre-approval, which names the lender, obviously. And so if that lender becomes different, then the buyer must deliver to the seller an updated contact for the buyer's loan if he's getting a loan from somebody or she is getting a loan from somebody other than the lender that provided the pre-qual or pre-approval within 1 day of the seller's request. If it's an FHA or VA loan is checked, again, in 3E, then the FHA VA Mandatory Clause is incorporated into the contract and is to be signed by all parties. It becomes automatically part of the contract. And of course, that mandatory clause says, notwithstanding any other provision in the contract. What does that mean? It cannot be waived. The buyer's removed his contingencies. He wrote a non-contingent loan contingent offer on his VA purchase. Doesn't matter. Notwithstanding any other provision in this contract, the purchaser will not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property or forfeit his earnest money deposit unless gets a written statement, i.e. appraisal, for not less than, and that number must be the purchase price. It cannot be a reduced amount. Civil code doesn't allow that. So, it should be the purchase price, but I think the code actually says that you have to state the dollar amount and it must be the purchase price. Okay. Now, the buyer shall, within the time specified in 3E, provide a list of repairs an FHA or VA loan might require, lender might require to issue the loan, and that must be provided within 17 days of acceptance. So that's that clause there. Notwithstanding any agreement that the buyer may obtain FHA or VA financing, seller has no obligation to pay for repairs that the lender requires unless the seller has no obligation to pay for repairs that the lender requires unless the seller has agreed to do that. So just because a VA appraisal requires a repair does not obligate the seller to make those repairs. Balance of the purchase price, including all cash funds deposited in escrow pursuant to escrow holder's instructions. Limits on credit. Most of you are familiar with that. I am watching the time. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly so we get to questions if we have any. Don't want to keep you too long. Limits to credit. Lenders do not allow buyers to walk away with money. That's the simplest way to look at it. So if the seller is going to give the buyer credit, that credit must be that information must be disclosed to the buyer's lender. And that amount cannot exceed what the lender will allow. Now, the lenders pretty much allow just about 100% of closing costs to be paid. Used to be, a distinction between recurring and non-recurring. That is beginning to go away if it hasn't gone away completely. I've not seen too many lenders not allowing non-recurring to be included, recurring to be included. But if they do, then they're going to reduce the amount of credit they will allow. And if they reduce the credit that they will allow, then that credit will be likewise reduced. And so it's important when you represent a buyer that you check with your lender to make sure you're negotiating a credit of $10,000. You already have a $5,000 credit in your purchase contract, and you only have $9,000 in closing costs. 10 and 5 is 15. You got 9 in closing costs. You're 6,000 light. That will be eliminated. There is no, automatic adjustment on the purchase price. So you'd want to have that worked out in advance. Maybe you do have to reduce the purchase price. In some cases, we figured out ways to increase the closing cost to the buyer's benefit. In other words, by extended HOA coverage and a rate buy down. The lender could increase his closing costs if you bought your rate down a little bit, which benefits the buyer. So there's ways to negotiate how to use up a lot of that credit. But it's not going to be the buyer getting a check, and it's going to be lost if it's not spent in the transaction. Okay, additional financing, verification of down payment and closing costs pursuant to paragraph 6B, and this is 6B right below it. So within the time specified in 3H3, see how you go back to the grid. All the time frames are in the grid. And so that's when these verification of loan application must be done. And hopefully, you've required it, you got it with the offer, or if they, checked after the offer, you would get it later. So that's the, letter from the buyer's lender saying that they, upon a review of the buyer's written application and credit report, are qualified for the loan specified in 3E, and that's the terms of the loan. All right, buyer stated financing. This is another thing that comes up all the time. I'm watching the clock. We're going to go about another 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to try to get a little further into this. Buyer stated financing. So the buyer's buying it all cash, and now he wants to get a loan. Well, the bad news for a seller is the buyer can get a loan if he wants. The buyer must pursue the financing they specified in the agreement if they're changing the financing, even if the buyer elects to pursue alternative financing, but they're allowed to pursue alternative financing. Now, if that financing wasn't agreed to by the seller has no obligation to cooperate with the buyer getting this alternative financing. So if an all-cash buyer wants to get a loan, seller can't stop them. But the seller doesn't have to cooperate. Now, if you are trying to get your loan, you're the buyer that switched from all cash to getting a loan. Within the first 17 days, the seller really can't keep an appraiser out. CAR Legal has ruled that if it's after 17 days, a seller might say, well, I'm not letting your appraiser in. I'm sorry. So it's on the 21st day, the 23rd day. Now the buyer wants his appraiser to come out because now he wants to get a loan. He could have a problem. Contract gives the buyer a right to enter the property for investigation purposes, to look at the property, and to bring anybody with him he wants. That would be an appraiser in the first 17 days. So you really can't stop a loan if the buyer is acting on that within the first 17 days, and you cannot interfere with closing. I guess CAR Legal, I've never had this come up, but CAR Legal says they've had problems with sellers refusing to close, even though the buyer got their loan, because the buyer said, nope, you were going to buy all cash. You didn't. I'm not going to let you buy it at all. You won't get away with that. And now the contract, you won't get away with it in court. I can promise you that. The contract actually says that you won't get away with that if you're the seller, as long as you close on time. And when do you close? That's specified in paragraph 3B. And so the buyer's inability to get an alternative financing that they've come up with that's not part of the excuse, not part of the contract, will not be an excuse for the buyer not to close escrow as specified in the agreement. Okay, I think I'm going to end it here. We're going to pick up. I like to have gotten through 2 more paragraphs, but I really don't want to keep you long. We made pretty good progress. So we're going to end it on paragraph 7, and we'll pick it up on paragraph 7 when we get together. And I think it'll be in 2 weeks. And we're going to do probably 2 more classes, get them in before the release of the form. So you've gotten a pretty good overview of the entire RPA. All right. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Okay, so Brenda says, when we check the forms under 4A, B, and C, will the addendums load automatically?
Yes. When you check one of those boxes, anytime you check a form, whether it be an advisory or an addenda, the SWIPy, the septic and well and propane or property, I think it's actually property monuments is what the P stands for, but they added propane to that as well. You check that that box, it's going to attach to your contract. And, of course, the boilerplate will be filled out, the buyer, the seller, the property address, and then you can check the appropriate boxes. And that's why CAR did not automatically check the Sbsa. If I were a buyer's agent, I would make sure my buyer got an Sbsa. Of course, it's a required document, but I'm not sure I'd attach it to the purchase contract either, because that means every time you send the purchase contract to somebody, it's going to include those forms. I get the wire fraud advisory. I get the fair housing advisory. With every time I ask for a copy of the RPA, I get that as well, almost every time, because you check them, they get attached. It's a good thing for addenda and some advisories. It's good to have it as part of the contract. Certainly the addenda.
So Drew Reynolds asks, so is the TOPA, the TIP addenda current, or are they different?
I'm sorry, which addenda?
TOPA?
That's a new form, tenant occupied property addendum.
And the TIP?
The TIP, the TIP is going to go, I think the TIP is going to go away. The tenant in possession, I think that's going to go away, and the TOPA is going to replace it.
Judy Spady asks, what about a property with an ADU?
Okay, what about it?
I think she was referring to a specific part of your class, but I don't know which part.
Yeah, right now, ADUs, they're not on a unique parcel number. They're not going to be. They're not split off yet. With AB 9, you're going to be able to split ADUs off if you want, as long as the lot size is large enough, and you're willing to give up, half your lot. The splits require the lot sizes to be equal in size, more or less, and the unit has a minimum number of square footage to be split. So ADUs right now would convey with the property, of course. And yeah, okay. If she's asking, okay, I have somebody living in the ADU, I would attach the TOPA. Yeah, because that's probably a tenant. If it's your minor child, then that doesn't count. But if it's your grown child, that's a legal tenant. Not on title. If it's
Larry,
because the two of you aren't getting along with each other, well, that's not a tenant. If she's on title too. Go ahead.
Larry asks, if the buyer intends to occupy, do you use the NODPA?
It's not so much if the buyer intends to occupy, yeah, then you don't need the NODPA. If a buyer wants to buy a home that's in foreclosure and the notice has already been filed and the owner is an occupant, but the buyer is going to be an occupant, then the NODPA is not required. That's a good distinction, Larry. Thanks.
Libby asks, if the NOD was filed and then bankruptcy declared, does this RPA apply?
Well, first of all, that's two separate issues. If a bankruptcy is declared, then temporarily the homeowner, I'm going to say this sort of in a casual way, the homeowner loses, ownership of the property temporarily. It becomes part of his bankruptcy estate. Now, in bankruptcy, if it's your personal residence, there's a huge, now it's very large, personal exemption. So if your debt is, your debt would have to be huge. I think a personal exemption is in the $600,000 or $700,000 range, up from homestead exemption. I'm sorry, not personal, homestead exemption, up from around 130, 140 before the law was passed. Then the law was passed to take a homestead exemptions basically up to the median sale price of the area. So if your debt is less than that, then you get to keep your house. And so the bankruptcy trustee will release the house back to you, usually early in the process. And so once it's released back to you, you can sell it. And, again, if an investor bought it because there was an NOD filed, you still have to use the NODPA. But the bankruptcy, the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. If you have a specific issue or question, give me a call and I'll go through that.
I just want to know if I can use the new RPA for that.
For
the if the buyer comes in, they're intending to occupy the property, regardless of whether it's in bankruptcy or that the owner, it's now in bankruptcy. So we still use the RPA,
Right.
this RPA.
If it's an owner occupant and it's a single family house, you use the new RPA. If it's an investor buyer, you'd use the NODPA. I would argue that if the contract is signed while it's in bankruptcy and the trustee of the bankruptcy has not released it yet, you've got an invalid contract because the seller can't really sell it. So you got to go to the trustee and of the bankruptcy and get, if the seller wants to sell it, the seller needs to have his bankruptcy attorney go to the trustee and get it released. That is generally a fairly easy, simple thing to do because the law doesn't allow the trustee to sell that asset. You got a Rolls Royce in the garage and you want that released because you're also entitled to a vehicle. You're not going to be entitled to that. Trustee's not going to release that. Nope. You don't get $100,000. Well, maybe today, not that much, $100,000 for a car, but that's going to be held by the trustee to liquidate to pay off some of your debt. But you've got $600,000 protected as equity in your house. So, probably going to get released.
So Ron has the next question. It says, how would you know if there's a tenant or not?
Okay.
Is that what you meant, Ron?
Let me explain that. Okay, we're doing an RPA on a property we don't know a whole lot about because this is we're doing an offer to purchase. How do we know if there's tenants in there or not in order to check off that tenant occupied property addendum, or should we put that in all of our deals?
I'm not sure I put it in all of them, although that's an interesting thought. I mean, that's sort of a prophylactic way to make sure you don't have a problem.
Well, what I'm talking about is, okay, if a girlfriend could be a tenant, what about a 21-year-old son?
21-year-old son's a tenant.
Right. So
Right.
if they've got kids living with them over 18 years old, they should be considered tenants.
Now I wouldn't get too concerned about it in the sense that, and I hate to say this, to be so cavalier, but you're probably not going to have as big a problem. I have an adult child living with me. If I were to sell the home, my adult child's going with me. He's not.
I agree.
Not around.
My girlfriend,
right?
She would be too.
Yeah, well, but believe it or not, sometimes not. A boyfriend, girlfriend, I'd be more concerned. So if you got two people living in the house and you look at title and there's only one name on that title, that's a red flag. And so you want to, and I don't mean a red flag like terrible. I mean, a conversation with a listing agent, and maybe just, instead of always including the TOPA, maybe you make it automatic. Is there any adult living in this house that's not on title? Maybe that's a question you ask the listing agent every time you're getting ready to write an offer.
Because when we're writing an offer, we don't know who's living in that house.
Right. And your contract wouldn't be illegal if you wrote it and there is a tenant. It's just that you lost the opportunity, to take advantage of some of the protections that a seller has for a tenant occupied sale. That TOPA is a very seller-friendly document. Why? Because right now, even as I speak, there might be somebody executing a contract, a seller, obligating the seller to get the tenant out and not having a clue that ain't going to happen. And so now you're liable to damages to the buyer, whatever they are. And it could be huge. With a TOPA starting in the second week of December, I want to get my tenant out. He won't get out. He can't get out. And so the worst that's going to happen is either buy it with the tenant, or I need to reimburse you for your appraisal and physical inspection. And I'm done. And that's a lot better than selling a house with a tenant in it and you can't get the tenant out and you don't have that protection.
Okay, Barbara Dudek wants to know, so when should the Sbsa be signed and part of the contract?
Well, I think it should be signed when you write the contract. I think the Sbsa should be provided to a buyer early on. I mean, writing it when they write the contract, not a bad idea, but certainly within the first few days of the escrow.
But what, if I may, Walt, hi, it's Barbara. You had just said that when an offer goes through, rather than having 50 pages or whatever,
Right.
that you wouldn't include that. So I'm a little fuzzy on your interpretation. If you could help me, please.
I don't want to tell you not to do it, because if you want to do it and make sure that the buyer gets it, that's a good thing to do. I just want to let you know, just keep in mind that will now be printed as a part of the RPA. Because it's attached to the RPA, it becomes part of that. And, not the end of the world. I've been looking at RPAs for a lot of years, and I've been ignoring the Sbsa because it's not part of the issue, but yet it comes into my in basket. So maybe I made too big a deal of it. I just wanted to kind of point it out. CAR actually pointed out to me in the training I went through that they deliberately didn't check that box, although they considered it. And the reasoning they gave was, just to save paper when people are printing their RPA, that doesn't print automatically as well. So I just want to point that out. But I would not change what you're doing for a minute. More important than 16 or 18 or whatever number of pages it is the fact that you're giving it to the buyer. That's the critical thing. So whatever works for you, do it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Drew Reynolds wants to know, is there any restriction from buyer changing the lender?
There's no restriction, with the exception that the buyer must inform the seller of the new lender. And I would argue, and I think I'm not reaching it all, you would be entitled to a pre-qualification from that lender, because the named lender, you have to provide a pre-qualification. So you get a pre-qualification from a lender, and then that lender disappears. It's useless. It's meaningless. So now you change lenders. Well, you need to provide me, if I'm the seller, a pre-qualification, a pre-approval, whatever the contract said. Some contracts actually, underwriting approval, right down to getting an underwriter approved. So whatever the contract says, that would need to be provided now with the new lender's name on it.
Vicky Barnles says, what if the buyer puts in the box on the VA amendment clause the price that's higher than the purchase price? For example, if the price is $700,000, but the buyer puts $720,000, is that allowable, and will that work around this?
It's an interesting question in the sense of, that is the civil code doesn't allow a lower number. In fact, the civil code says the purchase price. So I don't think you can put a higher number in. So I would just correct that with an addendum, and have it replaced with the correct one.
Okay, Barbara Dudek has another question that says, so a VA or FHA buyer can pay for termite section 1 and 2 repairs for a clearance? And
Yes.
I think Matt Eller answered that. And said yes.
The only prohibition relative to termite or wood pest destroying organisms is the VA does not allow the buyer to pay for the report. But the buyer can, in fact, pay for the work to be done. And not to take a long time here, but sometimes if you got a problem, call me, because, I can't solve all your problems, but I can get kind of creative. We had a situation where we represented the buyer. They bought a house. It wasn't in this area. Actually, it was in Morro Bay. But we represented him. He bought this house. It was a block from the ocean, and he bought it probably at half its value. And he intended to knock it down and build his dream home, nice little home, a block from the ocean, Morro Bay. Ever been to Morro Bay? You can appreciate that, kind of nice. Well, the seller figured out that, I sold it for too little, and did everything he could to cancel. Now, the buyer bought this with VA, and the seller couldn't cancel. The buyer was performing every step of the way, except they had agreed to do a termite inspection. They did not agree to a clearance. So the seller gave us a termite inspection, and the VA required termite repairs to be made. And the seller said, I gotcha, because you're not going to make the repairs. I'm not going to let you make the repairs. And we are talking about he was probably a couple of $100,000 under market price. So it took a little bit of leverage. I don't want to get out on a limb here, but the way VA loans work is the lender needs that clearance to sell the loan. lender can make the loan if he wants to keep it. He can say, okay, no clearance, but he needs the clearance to sell the loan. So I convinced the lender to allow it to close. I had a irrevocable payment made to the termite guy. They were going to go out there and tent it, which was ludicrous because they're going to knock it down anyway. But he couldn't get his VA loan unless he tented it. So we did that after close of escrow, but we had to do it within about 3 days. And we were able to negotiate with the lender because I knew the lender wasn't going to package his loan up for at least a week or two. So give me 2 or 3 extra days. I'll get you a clearance and you can package your loan and everybody's happy and the buyer gets the house. Now that was a pretty unusual circumstance, but you can get things done sometimes that are problematic. Put enough heads together or get a couple of people together and they get it done. So that's what we did. I'm not sure what we were talking about. I got off my story here. Sorry.
For Q16 and Q17, can we put the buyer to pay inspection fees or TC fees?
I'm not sure, what inspection fees, you'd have to list what those inspection fees are. TC fees, I would like to suggest I'll do a class on that. I would like to say that is somewhat problematic. Having a buyer in the purchase contract pay TC fees. It kind of depends who the TC is, the relationship of the TC to the brokerage. And so if you want your buyer to pay TC fees and you haven't signed a buyer broker agreement, then maybe give me a call and we can discuss how to get that done and not be in violation of civil code. California civil code is actually a bigger problem than RESPA.
So Judy Spady she didn't have sound. So going back to her question about ADUs, her question was, do we need to use the multifamily 2 to 4 unit form with sales for ADUs? No,
you don't have to. If you have
let's see. Jeannie Dominguez. So can a VA buyer pay above the appraisal price if he is putting money down, or does the mandatory clause prohibit this?
That's a great question. No, the buyer can pay as much as he wants. His loan, if he's getting 100% loan, it's going to be the appraisal. If he's getting a 95% loan, it'll be based on the appraisal. But a buyer can volunteer to make up the difference. He just can't be held liable to any contingency removal and lose his deposit. So it doesn't prohibit the buyer from paying more than the appraisal price. It protects the buyer from losing his deposit if he doesn't want to.
That's all the questions I have in the chat, unless anyone else has one.